Hello and welcome to another Mjolnir the Movies Intermission. I'm David Yorkshire, and in this particular intermission I wanted to return to the film Birth of a Nation by W.D. Griffith, and I wanted to look around the film really at the context and legacy, because I think that it's an incredibly important film, both in terms of the history of filmmaking and cinema, but also in the context of the history of cultural struggle. Now, to begin with D.W. Griffith himself, D.W. Griffith was born in Oldham County in Kentucky, so very much in the countryside, and his father was a Confederate Army colonel, although sadly he died when Griffith himself was 10. But his father told him stories, and you've seen that was a big inspiration to Griffith in the little interview that I put up there on the Mjolnir the Movies channel. And after his father died, after telling him these stories of the Civil War and so on, Griffith moved to Louisville in Kentucky also. But he didn't like the city very much at all. He was very much a country-oriented boy. But he spent a lot of time in the library, and he also had a job in the bookstore, which was frequented by the local intelligentsia. So he very much had a good education, really self-educated, and he was an intelligent guy. And he started as a playwright for the stage, and also was an actor in the 1890s, and acted in plays by Ibsen and Maeterlinck and Shakespeare. So he was an incredibly cultured guy, and he was impressed by the power of early cinema, and particularly how it drew the crowds. And really, I think that he very much saw that cinema was going to replace theatre at some point. And so he went to act in biograph films, and after the director there fell ill, Griffith was employed as a director, and Biograph was a failing company. But he changed the fortunes of Biograph with his first film, The Adventures of Dolly, which was well received. And so Griffith became the sole director of Biograph. And the thing about Griffith was he also liked to put a moral in the film as well. So, for example, in another film that he directed, and this would come back, this idea, A Corner in Wheat is the film, where he attacks the bourgeois' greed, and very much sees that the bourgeoisie very much can be a great negative in society, and we'll come back to that theme later. It's a film where cross-cutting is used as well, this technique that Griffith has become very famous for, and it juxtaposes scenes to show the cause and effect of the businessman who basically causes poverty by cornering the world wheat market. And this idea of cross-cutting was influenced by Dickens's narratives. Now, Dickens is interesting, Charles Dickens, because he's a fellow rightist, and so we have a distinct train of cultural thought that's coming through, because the right is incredibly cultured, although the left don't like to admit it so much. Now, Birth of a Nation itself was very much inspired by the 5 real epic films of Thomas Ince, and also the Italian films. The Italians were building up to 8 reelers, and the problem was that where Griffith was at Biograph, they only wanted 2 reelers because this was for commercial reasons. And again, we have this idea of business and bourgeois capitalism really encroaching and limiting art. And So Griffith left Biograph, and his co-workers, this crew, this team, this company, is often called Griffith's company. So I'll continue to refer to them as his company. They left with him. So Lillian Gish, particularly, who of course he made as an actress, and The Birth of a Nation was the first 12-reel film. This is a historical landmark. Nothing like this had been produced, nothing on this scale. Griffith found financial backers for this in the Aitken brothers, and they gave him a budget of $40,000. And this $40,000 was blown basically on the single battle scene, the siege of Petersburg. So just this one battle scene absolutely blew his entire budget. And this was actually filmed on the 50th anniversary of the siege of Petersburg as well. Griffith went to the Aitken brothers and asked them to bail him out and to give him more money. He wanted an extra $10,000 to finish the film. They refused, and so he had to ask people he knew, including his company. And basically all these people, they gave him money to pay for the extras and so on, and they themselves, his crew, his own personal company, they went without any pay, because they could see that what they were producing was something that was historical, something that was amazing, and also because of loyalty to Griffith himself. Griffith was extremely generous with money when he had it. So it worked both ways, and this is very much in contradistinction to the business-like mentality of many companies and the film industry that we know now. Now, at this time, to put this all into political context as well, the blacks had gained more and more political representation, and for example, they became a majority in the Louisiana House of Representatives in 1878, before Jim Crow and so on limited their power. But every time that blacks had got power, they started increasing in crime, particularly rape against white women. And black supremacist writers of the time, like Ida B. Wells, have tried to play that down and tried to deny that this was true. But as we'll see, that there were many cases of this, and all mainstream texts now state that this rape of white women by blacks was a myth. But this is simply untrue. The idea that is portrayed now is that this myth was created by white supremacists to justify Jim Crow, in other words, the segregation laws. But if you actually look at the Western world now, what is happening? Well, the more blacks get power politically, the more it seems to encourage them to act violently against whites, and particular in terms of raping women and basically murdering men, although often the women are murdered them as well. We've only to look at what's happening in South Africa at the moment, where there's a distinct genocide going on there, but this is happening all over the Western world, and it's in various stages of development, but South Africa being the worst, of course. Now, the first female senator, for example, Rebecca Felton, called on men to protect white women from black rapists. She was technically the first female senator, although really she was only sworn in for one day, and it was rather a ceremonial thing. But she was very much active in politics, and her husband was a senator. And there were many race riots as well at the time. Just to give you an idea of how many race riots, just the major ones I'm going to look at here. So you had the Wilmington in North Carolina in 1898, New Orleans in 1900, Manhattan in New York in 1900 as well, Atlanta in 1906, Ononcock, Virginia in 1907, and Slocum, Texas in 1910. So there were lots of race riots, and I'm going to concentrate on the riots that happened in Springfield now, because these are quite important in the development of what became the NAACP. And there were three race riots in Springfield, Illinois, and the one that gets talked about a lot is the 1908 race riot, because that's the one that really led to the formation for the NAACP. They always complain simultaneously both about the races being separate, and yet simultaneously complain when there's forced integration and violence. So you can't debate with them, because quite simply they have two propositions that are counter-propositional, because they're always wanting to force people together, and yet whenever they're forced together it results in violence. And it's really because these liberals, these Marxists and so on, they have this strange fetishization of blacks, and you'll see that in their writing and so on, and they're obsessed with black sexuality and so on. But most whites have just wanted to remain separate and not be miscegenated out of existence, which is basically what the liberals are always wanting, always pushing for miscegenation, as you've noticed in their literature and so on. But these riots of 1908, they happened when a Negro attempted to rape a girl called Blanche Ballard, and her father rushed out to protect her and attacked the black man who had broken into their house and tried to rape Blanche Ballard while she slept. And the Negro pulled a knife on the father and stabbed him to death as he defended his family. So then a riot occurred of whites against the black areas of the town. Particularly they attacked the bars and so on, so the black-owned bars. But two race riots happened before this in Springfield as well, one in 1904 and one in 1906. The 1904 race riot happened because a black man shot a policeman dead who had come to arrest Richard Dixon, the Negro who had been assaulting his wife. How often do we hear of that? And Dixon was arrested and then lynched, and black saloons were attacked by the mob again as tempers boiled over, because this was an ongoing process of blacks and whites being antagonistic towards each other. There will have been constant niggling and constant attacks and violent behavior on both sides. Then again in 1906, two blacks stabbed three whites in a bar, one of whom was meant to have been one of the guys who lynched Richard Dixon, and a Negro as well in a separate incident also shot and killed a white guy who was completely innocent, called Martin Davis, and he was just a white brakeman working in a railway yard. And this was a completely racially motivated attack. So the liberals never really talk about this racially motivated black on white violence, and so then the white mob again attacked black bars and homes and so on. So basically all sides are guilty of violence. The idea of the Jim Crow laws of segregation was to stop that. It was basically to keep people apart, to keep the races apart, and to stop the violence between them, which is a good idea, you would think, but apparently this is not a good idea according to liberals and so on. And the Jim Crow laws had crept in from the late 1800s to counter the Reconstruction legislation after the American Civil War, and it had crept in particularly in several southern states. But Woodrow Wilson, who came from the South and became president in 1912, he brought in segregation into the civil service and into federal jobs and so on. So he brought Jim Crow laws really into America as a whole. For example, all the federal jobs like the Postal Service were segregated and so on. So and this was in 1913, and this was really to prevent strife between the races. Now, the NAACP, of course, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured Persons, this was founded after the 1908 Springfield riots, although there had been groups leading up to that, and various different black rights groups and so on, and lobby groups and everything. And this was really founded, the NAACP, by a mixture of blacks, Jews and white liberals. So just to give you the founders, you had Mary White Ovington, who was a white suffragette, Moorfield Story, who was a white and descended of Puritans and abolitionists, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a Negro, Henry Moskowitz, who was a Jewish immigrant from Romania, Ida B. Wells, who was black, and we've just mentioned her, a writer, Mary Talbot, who was also black and involved in various black groups beforehand, William English Walling, who was white but married to a Jewess called Anna Strunsky, who also was involved in the foundation of the NAACP, and was a communist. Archibald Grimke, who was a half-caste son of a slave woman and her master. Mary Church Terrell, another black woman. Florence Kelly, who was a white married to a Jewish Russian communist called Lazar Wishnevetsky. I've had to write that down because it's hard to pronounce. Oswald Garrison Villard, who was white and came from a line of abolitionists and suffragists. Charles Russell, who was white again and communist son of abolitionists. Jane Addams, who again was white, and her father was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. Lillian Wald, who was a Jewess and worked for Jewish causes. So these were the founders of the NAACP, but the Jews soon took over, actually, and more Jews came into the NAACP and brought with them, of course, financial power. But it's interesting that these Jews are newly immigrated, and they started immediately to try to undermine the WASP society, White American Protestant Society. So you got several Jews soon taking over, like the Rabbi Stephen Wise, Joel and Arthur Springarn, Rabbi Emil Hirsch, Julius Rosenwald, Julian Mack, Jacob Billikopf, Jacob Schiff, Herbert Lehman. Herbert Lehman is interesting because he's a son of one of the Lehman brothers, so a considerable amount of financial clout comes with him, and we'll come back to him a bit later on, so stick around for that because he's very important. Herbert Seligman, Martha Groening. But the thing is that even though the Jews were taking over, Griffith himself, D.W. Griffith, was quite unaware of all this, and he certainly had Jewish acquaintances in the film industry. But there were a number of black lobby groups emerging at the time, and they would go on to become quite influential. So you had the National Association of Colored Women, the Alabama Federation of Colored Women's Club, Frederick Douglass Women's Club, Oklahoma Federation of Negro Women's Clubs, the National League on Urban Conditions Among Negroes, the National Negro Business League, the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks of the World. So you had quite a lot of organized political clout coming in to challenge white America, basically. It's interesting actually that some of the Jews got rich actually from Birth of a Nation. Louis B. Mayer, for example, who was later of MGM, of course, he certainly got rich from Birth of a Nation by buying the screening rights for New England from D.W. Griffith. It made him quite a considerable profit. Interestingly, Louis B. Mayer, he I don't know if you can call it help really, because it's a strange kind of help. Because when Lillian Gish's career stalled with the advent of talkies, Louis B. Mayer went to Gish and proposed to her to invent a public scandal to raise a profile, which the ever-classy Lillian Gish refused to get involved in. And she was absolutely a first-rate lady, and this is one of the reasons, of course, why they have tried to get rid of her name at Bowling Green State University, where the drama Department of Theatre and Film was named after Lillian and Dorothy Gish, and this year, of course, their names have been taken away, although there is a lobby at the moment to try to get her name reinstated. But Lillian Gish, of course, was the star of The Birth of a Nation. Gish as well refused to criticize Griffith as well later in life, despite constant media pressure, and she always referred to him as Mr. Griffith. And this, the fact that she's refused to get involved in the racial debates and so on that go around Birth of a Nation really made her into a pariah among the left, and they, of course, have hated her for that. Now, The Birth of a Nation was the first film to be shown in the White House. Thomas Dixon was an old college friend of Woodrow Wilson and showed it to Wilson himself. Wilson approved of it, actually. He apparently said during the showing of the film that it's like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true. But he recanted under pressure from liberals and black lobbyists and so on, and said that he'd never said that and so on. But as you can see there from this letter actually sent to Griffith on the 5th of March there, because he'd seen it on the 18th of February in 1915, and he states that I congratulate you on a splendid production. So he quite obviously approved of this, but was cowardly in some ways, although of course he increasingly relied on the black vote. This, of course, is a problem in a multiracial society, where basically you have to appeal to the interests of other races and of their wants and requirements and wishes, and this makes you basically conflicted between the interests of one group and the interests of another group. And increasingly, of course, all the different parties in the West have abandoned the interests of white people and gone over to the interests of persons of color and of the Jews as well. Now the black lobby, particularly the NAACP, and especially a particular black lobbyist called William Monroe Trotter, who was a bourgeois black businessman, they campaigned against the showing of The Birth of a Nation, so they tried to have it taken out of cinema theatres, and they'd campaigned successfully back in 1905 to have Dixon's play of The Klansman, so the play version of the book The Klansman, taken out of theatres, and but this time they didn't succeed. They tried to blockade cinema lobbies at The Birth of a Nation showings, but failed in most places. They succeeded in some, but failed in most places. The police had them removed and so on. Of course, they will have used a bit of pushing and shoving and intimidation and so on at crowds. But the NAACP membership grew because of the birth of a nation, because many blacks saw it as a threat to their interests. So they could actually see the power of this particular piece of art and how it would have an impact on the public consciousness. And so the NAACP membership grew, it doubled in fact to about 9,000. However, in response to the birth of a nation, equally whites banded together, and the film had a particular influence on William Joseph Simmons, who formed the second version of the Ku Klux Klan. The first version had been repressed by the government back in the 1870s and had basically had almost disappeared. So Simmons, he started it again, and also there was the Leo Frank case as well, this Jew who had raped and murdered a white woman at the same time, and that was also a big influence on the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. So the two things together really were an enormous influence, particularly, of course, how the Jews also lobbied to get Leo Frank found innocent when he was absolutely guilty, and we saw this time the foundation of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, by B'nai B'rith. But in spite of all this pressure against whites and so on, the Ku Klux Klan membership basically went up to over 100,000 in just a few months. And by the early 1920s, it had reached between 4 and 5 million. That is a considerable percentage of the population of America at the time. Griffith himself, he didn't approve of the second Klan. He saw it as a bit of a rabble, which it was really, because it simply didn't have the officer corps of the first Klan. And there was a lot of dubious actions by Klan members and their leaders. In particular, there was one case by one of the Klan leaders called D.C. Stevenson, who himself raped and murdered a white woman called Madge Oberholzer. And the Klan tried to cover this up and so on. After this particular case, the Klan became more and more discredited in the eyes of the general public, and so it went into decline. However, the Ku Klux Klan and Birth of a Nation, they did influence, certainly influence immigration policy, because the Birth of a Nation had a special screening at the Raleigh Hotel Ballroom, which was attended by many members of Congress and the Senate, particularly the Secretary of the Navy was a big figure, Josephus Daniels, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward Douglas White, were in attendance. And so then you had in 1921 the passing of the Emergency Quota Act, which extremely restricted immigration from outside of Northern Europe. And this was further enforced and made even stricter by the Immigration Act of 1924. In fact, what they did with the quotas was that basically the immigration had to be limited to 3% of the particular population demographic. So, in other words, if there were loads of Jews wanting to come in, for example, or loads of black Africans wanting to come in, the maximum you could have was 3% of the population that were already in America. And this was also then tightened to 2% with the Immigration Act of 1924. And it was specifically to keep the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community in an extreme majority. And this lasted until 1965, when you had a push, particularly by Emanuel Seller, who of course we'll come to in a little moment with the Hart-Celler Act. But even before that, from the point where this Immigration Act was introduced in 1924, Emanuel Seller petitioned against it and used his political clout, along with Herbert Lehman, who we've discussed earlier. Yes, Herbert Lehman, who's been funding the NAACP. And in fact, there is now a Herbert Lehman Education Fund scholarship for the NAACP, and there's the Herbert Lehman Legal Defense Fund, and so on. And so he has a considerable amount of financial clout behind him, as one of the sons of the Lehman brothers, of course. So Emanuel Seller and Herbert Lehman, and they're both Democrat politicians, of course, because during this time the Northern Democrats have become basically leftists, whereas the Southern Democrats, often called Dixiecrats, are still the old kind of Democrat. So in other words, the ideology that has come from the plantation owners and so on, they're still around, but the Northern Democrats are gaining ever more power, and of course this means that they leapfrog eventually the Republican Party. So in other words, they go from the right of the Republican Party over to the left of the Republican Party. So Emanuel Seller and Herbert Lehman are both of the Democratic Party, and they of course are sponsoring demographic change, basically. Lehman, he died in 1963, so basically Emanuel Seller had to find someone else to sponsor the immigration bill that he wanted to get in, to change the immigration policy of America, and therefore change the demographics, because they had tried to push a change back in 1951. And then in 1957, Lehman, he lost his seat in any case. Therefore, Seller became allied to Philip Hart, who was the son of a banker of Irish stock. Again, he's a bourgeois, and so this white liberal type, who have been worse actually than anyone else, because they have been a traitor to their own people, and they have basically ensured the decline of their own people. And they of course pushed through the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, D.W. Griffiths, of course, he was always anti-bourgeois. He saw right from the beginning, I think, how the bourgeoisification of society goes hand in glove with the liberalization of society. And so we remember, of course, the film A Corner in Wheat, which is anti-big business. And Griffith was also a founder member of United Artists, which was an attempt really to get away from the big business attitude of Hollywood in filmmaking. So he was a founder member of United Artists, along with people like Charlie Chaplin. I'll go into that in another video. Although he dropped out and then moved to Mamaroneck in New York to create his own studio away from Hollywood. The problem was that he couldn't make profitable films. Certainly one of the reasons was that the critics were against him. And there were other reasons. For example, as I've mentioned before, his lavish spending on films, on the artistry of filmmaking itself. And sadly, we often have to strike a balance between the two. And He couldn't make profitable films. The critics were against him. They called him old-fashioned, and so they swayed audiences against him. And they called him old-fashioned basically in terms of morality, that he was out of touch, out of sync with the roaring 20s liberal society. Because, of course, Griffith has always been a moralist, and he's always held to traditional morality. And so he lost Mamaroneck in 1924, basically due to mounting debts. But he still didn't care about money, actually, and he still created more films, and still spent lots of money on these films, and also on his family and friends and so on. But his last film, The Struggle, really signalled an end to his filmmaking career, although they did use him for one or two films after that, but not as a director in his own right. He was just brought in as a consultant on films and so on. But certainly 1931 was the year when he was basically more or less done with filmmaking. And it's a sad reflection really on society, I think, that someone of such stature, and he was regarded as the greatest filmmaker of all time at that point. He'd even done early experiments in talkies long before talkies became a thing. He did receive a special Oscar in 1936 to a 2-minute standing ovation, and in 1952 to 1999 the Directors Guild of America Lifetime Achievement Award for Distinguished Achievement in Motion Picture Direction was called the D.W. Griffith Award. And so he still had a massive amount of respect as a great artist, in spite of the fact that there was constant lobbying against him as this racist, evil. They couldn't really call him a Nazi because he wasn't, but he was. But they probably will in future, because they just throw these labels out to the left to basically people that they don't like. But he then had his name removed from the award, from the D.W. Griffith Award, in 1999. Interestingly, the first recipient of this award after the removal of his name was Steven Spielberg. Now, when Griffith died in 1948, just 3 Hollywood stars showed up for his funeral: Mary Pickford, Richard Barthelmess, and Lillian Gish, although there were other members of the film industry in attendance. But it's interesting how a lot of the Hollywood stars and so on, they didn't want to know. And I think that is a reflection on the fact that they're fickle, they're cowardly, they were afraid to be associated with this person who has become sort of a pariah because of the film that he's associated with, The Birth of a Nation, which one has to remember is just one film, just one of his works, of which there were many. And it's interesting, I think, that although Griffith is really associated with this one film because of what it is, both politically and culturally, this one film equally changed the course of history to an extent. Certainly for 50 years it did. It's interesting that when the Hart-Celler Act was being pushed through the Senate, they were pushing it through at the same time as it was the 50th anniversary of its release. And in those 50 years, The Birth of a Nation stood out as something that the left knew that it hated, because they knew that it had such a cultural impact on American society. And certainly when it was re-released in 1930, to promote Griffith's other film, which is the biopic of Abraham Lincoln. The NAACP lobbied again for its banning and so on, and were more successful than they had been when it was first released. So we can see that there was a progression, because this one film staved off the entire leftist propaganda machine, despite all the funding that the left has, despite all the big business and capital behind the left and in Hollywood and so on. This one film managed to have such a grip on hearts and minds. And what I would like to leave you with is this idea that one amazing piece of art can transform a society. And so I leave you with that idea, and as a tribute to a great man, D.W. Griffith.